Welcome to the podcast, Let the Prophet Speak. Today, we are studying the prophet Ezekiel, chapter 40, which, that's the Navi Ezekiel Perek Mem. This is Saul Weiner, the host of the podcast. Chapter 40 continues the prophecies of redemption and resurrection, and the prophecies of the return of the exile. However, this begins the series of several chapters in which Ezekiel describes the building of the third temple and what the building will look like. To a large degree, many of the upcoming chapters, including the one we're about to read today, go into nitty-gritty details of descriptions of measurements and buildings and rooms and gates and so on, building materials, as we shall learn. So many of the commentaries note that it seems that Ezekiel, when he describes this building, deliberately seems to leave out details, so that it would seem that if this was actually instructions for the building of the third temple, such as he was actually giving the measurements of how to build it and so on, there are many critical details that are left out, which makes it impossible to actually use these coming chapters as a way to build the actual third temple. So if you were to say, get together a group of people and decide, let's build the third temple and use the prophet's description here to build it, it would be impossible. We'll notice some of these things as we go along. And many commentaries assume that he did this because, and as we'll see, the emphasis of the prophet is that these buildings are built by God. The third temple is built by God in the redemption. These buildings are not meant to be built by human beings. Until, of course, the time has come when God tells us, and God builds the building and instructs us on what to do. So this wasn't meant as a blueprint so that we should take this blueprint and build, because the time of the redemption is the time of God's choosing. And this is an emphasis which we've had in the last several chapters, if you've been studying, that the redemption comes when God brings the people back. The redemption comes when God gathers the nation together. The redemption comes when God is the one that purifies us from our sins. And this was the crucial idea of humility, that it's not our power, it's not our might, it's not our greatness that makes it happen, but it is purely the mercy and the kindness and the justice of God that brings us back to our land and reestablishes a righteous kingdom under a righteous leader, and thus sanctifies his name in this world so that all the nations of the world learn this lesson. So in this context, we can go ahead and read the building of the third temple. We can read his description. There's another point that I want to make before we read this that I believe is crucial. Those of you that have been following along with me in this podcast realize that I rarely draw upon mystical sources as a source for the prophets that we're reading. And the reason for that is because most of the prophets, most of it, with some exceptions, such as but I'm talking not Ezekiel, the other prophets, occasionally, like we had in the 6th chapter of Isaiah, where Isaiah describes his ascent to heaven in a vision, where you have them describe the mystical experiences. But most of the time, the prophets are speaking in this world, and they're giving messages from God to the people as they live in this world, and they don't specifically touch upon mystical experiences. Ezekiel, though, on the other hand, has much more often than the other prophets described the chariot of God, as we had in the 1st chapter, and his visions as he ascended into heaven, and his visions of God taking him to Jerusalem, to the temple. And here this chapter 40, we're going to be reading a mystical vision, but Ezekiel is going to go into the details of the buildings that he sees, of the temple that he sees, and its construction. This is a very common and accepted mystical construct, the imagination of palaces, or the image of palaces that are used by a mystic as he ascends higher and higher into higher levels of heaven and closeness to God. In the Jewish tradition, we have this in what's called the Heichalot literature. These are the oldest mystical tradition in Judaism is the Heichalot literature, which means the literature of the palaces. Many books were written from the 2nd century all the way through the 13th and 14th century, and some that were considered in this genre of literature. One of the most famous is the Heichalot HaZohar, in which which is attributed to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yishmael, the Tanoim, the ones who lived in the time of the Mishnah in the 2nd century. And there's solid scholarly and archaeological evidence that this literature goes back at least to the 4th century, possibly earlier, so we do know that it is ancient, where they describe the palaces into which they ascended as they ascended towards God. The first palace, the second palace, and so on. In the world mystical tradition, we find very, very similar ideas described, specifically in the Catholic world, of which I am not an expert in these things, but I have been exposed to the works of Saint Teresa of Avila, who wrote a book, The Interior Castle, in which she describes her ascent through prayer, through the castle, through 7 levels of castles, until she was approached an intense and intimate relationship with God in the final castle. And we find this in many other cultures and traditions as well, this description of castles or buildings which represent the places in which the encounter between the human being and God becomes more and more intense. I think it's very important as we read these next chapters of Ezekiel to understand that this is what Yechezkel is doing. Yechezkel here is a mystic, and he is ascending farther and higher and closer and more intimate until he has an experience of being with God, which we'll see several chapters from now. Understand that as Ezekiel describes the temple, it makes sense that someone who lived among castles in Europe, for example, Saint Teresa, would use the image of castles, whereas Ezekiel would use the image of the Holy Temple, being a Kohen himself, a priest himself, who was exiled from there. To him, their spirituality of his mystical experience is something that he would describe in the terms of a temple. Other mystics may describe it in terms of buildings that they were familiar with. But the experience of approaching God through these castles is a very basic mystical experience. And here we have this experience being described by the prophets in the verses of the writings of the prophets. So let's, with that introduction, I think we can begin chapter 40, which is pretty long. We may only make it through half. At some points, the details can get a little boring. Please forgive me for saying that. However, it's important to study them and see what the kind of inspiration that we can get from these chapters. So let's begin with chapter 40, Be'esrim, verse 1. Be'esrim v'chamesh shana legalutenu, in the 25th year from our exile. So this is a jump from where he was speaking before. Until now, the dating that Ezekiel used was dating from the exile of Yehoiachin, which was, I forget exactly, was it 13 or 14 years prior to the destruction of the temple. And he was dating from the time when Yehoiachin was sent into exile in Babylon. But then the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, was destroyed. Judea was destroyed. The Jews that were left, the remnant of the people in the land, had completely left it and are gone. And the only significant Jewish community in the world is the community that's in Babylon. There's a small detachment that went to Egypt, which we studied about in the book of Jeremiah. And then there's scattered groups of remnants of Israel and Judah throughout the Middle East and parts of the world. But the main community now is in Babylon. So it's 25 years after the exile, after the complete destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple. So a time when we have very few prophets, possibly the exception of Daniel, but he didn't say too many prophecies at this time, and Yechezkel, Ezekiel, a time where the Jewish people were not familiar with their future, and it makes sense that this would be a time where Ezekiel would start to describe the actual rebuilding of the temple, and to remind the people that one day it will be rebuilt. And this happened Rosh Hashanah, in the first month of the year, B'asar l'chodesh, on the 10th day of the month, which many of you may or may not know is the day of Yom Kippur. Be'arba esrei shana, in the 14th year, asher huksa ha'ir, after, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. It's 25 years from Galut Yehoiachin, which is 14 years after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So it's not 25 years after the destruction of the temple, but it's 14 years after the destruction of the temple. The Etzem Hayom Hazeh, in the middle of this day, so he's saying it's on Yom Kippur, on the holiest day of the year, a day when a priest, especially one who was a priest, would be thinking about the temple service, which was the highlight of the day of Yom Kippur during the time when the temple stood, the date of the holy service that took place that time of year when the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would approach into the Holy of Holies, the one time a year when any person would ever enter the inner sanctum. But now Ezekiel is going to describe his vision of going into the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, what it looks like, until he eventually gets to the inner sanctum. The hand of God was upon me, and whenever he uses that term, we have seen until now, the visions that he sees are so intense that he feels like he can't proceed on his own, and God's hand supports him and gives him the support that he needs to withstand this incredible mystical vision. Vayaveo Shama, and God brought me there. Where did he bring me? B'marot Elohim, in visions of God. Heviani el Eretz Yisrael, he brought me to the land of Israel. Vayinicheni el hagavua mod, and he placed me on this high mountain. Now, one way of understanding this mountain would be that this mountain is Jerusalem. Another way of understanding this mountain is this mountain doesn't really exist, but this is a mountain from the vantage point from which he's able to look down upon the land of Israel. And see it. Alav ki mivnei ir minegev, and on the top of the high mountain, there seemed to be to the south of it the form of what appeared to be a built city. So is he looking down upon a city? Is that city Jerusalem? He doesn't name it. Is this high mountain actually Jerusalem from which he is looking towards the south? It's unclear. Vayaveo tishama, and he brought me there. V'hinei ish, and behold, there was a man, this man was shining like the shine of copper. Upitil pishtim biado, and in his hand he had a strap or a rope which was made of linen. Ukinei hamida, and he also had a rod, a measuring rod. V'hu omed bashar, and he was standing in the gate. So this man represented an angel, presumably a representative of God who had the measuring stick. He had the tools which a person who is surveying an area, measuring things out in order to set it up for a building. As we continue, Vayidaber elai ha'ish, and this man, the angel, spoke to me. I say an angel because he's seeing this man in a vision. He's seeing it in the form of a man. Presumably this is an angel of God talking to him in this vision. Ben Adam, human being, re'ei be'einecha, look with your eyes, see with your eyes, aznecha shema, and hear with your ears, v'sim libecha, and place your heart, think in your heart. Anyone who has read any of the literature describing these mystical experiences understand that he's saying, use your senses in order to get into your heart. Feel this in the depths of your soul. V'sim libecha, your eyes, your ears. That's the beginning stages of paying attention, focusing on what you're seeing, but ultimately, v'sim libecha, place your heart, l'chol asher ani mareosach, think about everything that I'm showing you. Ki leman haroscha huvasahena, the reason why you have been brought here to this place is in order that you should be shown these things. Hagedes kol asher atoro elevate Yisrael, and everything that you see, you are meant to repeat and teach to the people of Israel. V'hinei, and behold, what did I see? Choma michutz labayit saviv saviv. There was a wall outside the temple, the wall that surrounded it. Uviyad ish kinei amida, and in the hands of the man who was doing the measurements, sheish amos ba'amav tofach. His measurement was had 6 amot. It was 6 amot, 6 cubits long, and the type of cubit that was used was an amma tofach, was a little bit larger than the standard amma. It was an amma plus a handbreadth. Vayamad et rochav habinyan kana echad, and he measured the width of the building with one of the rods, v'koma kana echad, and it was the height of it was also 1 kana. So the wall was a cubit thick and a cubit high. So it was a relatively short wall and a relatively thick wall that surrounded the building. Vayavo, and this is verse 6, El Shar Asher Panav Derech HaKadima, and then he came to the gate that faced eastward. So this was a gate in the wall. Vayal b'malotav, and he went through the gate, and there were stairs that led through that gate up into the building that was inside that wall. Vayamad et Saf Hashar, and he measured the depth of the threshold of the gate, kana echad rochav, which was also one of these measuring rods worth wide. We had saf echad kana echad rochav, and the threshold of 1 was also depth. Why this is repeated is unclear. Whether there are 2 walls, it's unclear. But a lot of things, as I said, would be unclear. The hata and the open area, the ta is like the vestibule or the open area, kana echad. So as you walked in, then there was an open area which was also kana echad orach, but kana echad rochav, which was also 1 rod wide and 1 rod long. Uvein hataim, and between these rooms were chamesh amot, were 5 amot. V'saf hashar me'etzel ulam hashar me'abayit kana echad, and the threshold of the gate, which was next to the ulam, which was next to the vestibule of the gate, which was towards the house, towards the bayit, which is presumably the temple that is protected by this wall, and this area where there's the wall in these rooms was also kana echad. The fact that these are very difficult to understand, you can, if you'd like, look at some of the commentaries which try to measure these out and draw diagrams to show what they look like. But it seems pretty clear that these measurements are confusing. This is a mystical vision. This is not an architect describing how to build a building. So these are the things that he's seeing, and these are the things that he's describing. Vayomor et ulam hashar me'abayit kana echad. That's verse 8. And he measured the inner ulam, the inner vestibule, which was also another rod. Verse 9. Vayomor et ulam hashar shmona amos. And then he measured the vestibule of the gate. It seems to be the same one which he just measured, which was 1, is now shmona amot, is now 8 amot. The elav shtayim amot, and the elim are strong supports that hold up this room and hold up this area. They were 2 amot, 2 cubits tall. V'ulam hashar me'abayit, and the vestibule of the gate was facing the inner side. So you have to imagine this as a mystical vision. He's seeing these things one after another and just describing what he's seeing. V'to'ei hashar, and I'm not going to go into the mystical meaning behind each one, because these are things that if you just close your eyes and try to imagine where he's taking you, what he's seeing, you will have a much easier time getting value from these words than if you try to draw out a diagram and measure it. But you're welcome to do it that way if that's what suits your heart. V'to'ei hashar, this is verse 10. Again, the rooms of the gate, derech hakadim, which were near the east side, shaloshami po, there was 3 rooms, ushloshami po, and 3 rooms on the other side. Mida achas l'shashtam, they were all similar in size. Mida achas lo'elim mipo, and the supports that held it up were also 1 measurement. So we find he's talking about walls of protection. He's talking about gates through which we ascend. There are stairs through which we ascend. Those are visions, those are mystical visions of ascending towards God, creating a wall to protect between the place of God and the outside world, keeping out the outside influences, keeping out the things that distract one from worshiping God. And then those buildings that are in there, they require supports. They require strong elim, strong supports, which those are the supports within our souls that give us the strength to be with God, give us the strength to own up to our issues, our problems, give us the strength to be honest with ourselves, give us the strength to approach God in this vision. There are rooms. Each room has something for us within it to learn from, something with us within that room which we are supposed to contemplate, which we are supposed to learn. And those rooms are supported by these supports. Vayomad, this is verse 11, et rochav pesach hashar etzer amos, and the measurement of the width of the opening gate was 10 amot, orach hashar 13 amos, and the length of the gate itself was 13 amot. Again, these measurements don't necessarily make sense. Ugevul lifnei hataot amot echad, and the boundary which was before the open room areas was 1 cubit. V'yama achad gvul mipo, and it had another boundary of 1 cubit here. V'ata sheish amot mipo, sheish amot mipo, and then the open area was 6 amot in one direction and 6 amot cubits in the other direction. So then this angel is still measuring Vayomad et hashar, and he measured the gate migaga tolagago, from the roof of this room to its roof was rochav esrim uchamesh amot, was 25 cubits, pesach neged pasach, and there was a doorway within a doorway, which is also a very common mystical idea. That when you walk through one doorway and another doorway, each doorway representing leaving one level and entering another level closer towards the essence, closer towards the experience of closeness to God. Vayaset elim shishimama, and these big supports were built 60 cubits tall. The el hachatzer, and the aisle of the which supported the chatzer, which is the big yard which he's going to enter soon. Hashar saviv saviv. There was a gate next to the support of the chatzer, of the yard, all around it. The distance from the front of the outer gate to the front of the inner vestibule was 50 cubits. And then he describes another vision, which is another common vision which we see in descriptions of these things. The windows, atumot el hatayim. There was windows that had frames, that were framed windows that opened into these open rooms. V'el elehema, and towards their supports, lifnima, on the inside, l'shar saviv saviv, of the gate all around, v'chein la elamos, and there was also in the other open areas, the elam here is elam with a mem at the end, is like the word ulam, which is a vestibule. V'chalonot, and windows saviv saviv l'pnima, all around on the inside. V'el ayel timorim, and its supports was decorated with date trees, with date palm trees, with the images of date palm trees engraved into those supports. I'm going to learn just a few more verses. This is a long chapter. Vayivi'eni el hachatzer hachitzona, and God brought me to the outer chatzer. So I went through all of these structures and rooms were the first level that I went through in order to get into the chatzer, which is the courtyard. Okay, so all of this, he's not yet into the temple, but he's moving in stages towards the temple, towards the holier and holier portions, which is typically how these castles are described, one by one, getting more and more holy on a higher and higher level. So he brought me to the outer chatzer, to the outer yard, and there were rooms there, and there was also a ritzpah, which is a floor, paved floor, a soila chatzer saviv, which the entire courtyard was paved, presumably with like some kind of stone pavement on the floor. Shloshim l'shachos el ritzpah, and this ritzpah, the floor and the courtyard, was divided into 30 different rooms. Because there's about 40 verses in this chapter, I'm going to read 3 more. I'm up to verse 18 now until we get to 20, and then we'll stop and leave the rest of the chapter for the next podcast. V'haritzpah el kesef ha'she'arim, and the floor, the pavement of the floor, was on the shoulders of the gates, in other words, on the sides of the gates. Umat orach ha'she'arim, opposite the length of the gates, haritzpah tachtona, was the lower level of pavement. Vayomad rochav milifnei hashar hatachtona lifnei hachatzer hapnimi michutz mea ama hakadon v'atzafon. He measured the width of the lower chatzer, because there's going to be a higher chatzer that we're going to get to, which was in front of the inner gate, and he measured it all the way to the front of the outer gate, which was the first gate he came into, was 100 cubits long. So this is a very large paved outdoor courtyard area, which is also divided into lishachos, into rooms. V'hashar asher panav derech hatzafon, and the other gate, which faced the north direction, l'chatzar chitzona, which also faced the outer courtyard, madad arko v'rachbo. He measured its length and width. I'm going to do just a little more. As he measured its length and width, in verse 21, v'ta'av shalosha mipo, its rooms also had 3 on this side and 3 on this side. Ve'elav, and it supports the elamav, and its vestibules, haya kemidat hashar harishon, had similar measurements to the first gate, which I described to you before, that faced southward. Chamishim amo arko, 50 cubits long, v'rochav chamesh v'esrim ba'amah, and its width was 25 amot. And it also had windows of chalonav, its windows ve'elamav, and its vestibules v'timo rav, and its supports that were decorated as palm trees, or it could mean that they were actual palm trees used for support. Kemidat hashar was the same measurements as the gate, asher panav derech hakadim, which faced eastward, which was the first gate he described, and also uvema'alot sheva ya'alu bo. And this is a very common mystical number. There were 7 stairs within which, when you walked through the gate, you walked up 7 stairs, ve'ilamav lifnehem, and the vestibules into which you walked were in front of those stairs. In other words, after you walked up those stairs, you entered into the vestibules. So this, I'm going to stop here. This was verse 22. Next podcast, we're going to start from verse 23 and complete this chapter. I know that this description doesn't seem that exciting to you, but it's very important to think of it on the mystical level that I've been describing. And when you think of it that way and you understand it that way, then it starts to make sense, and it has to have a meaning to it. So close your eyes if you can when you listen to these words, and let the imagination of Ezekiel, which is now being directed by God himself, the Yad Hashem, and the mystical experience of Ezekiel, where he's being led by this angel who is showing him these measurements, try to go with him through these stages as he describes what he is seeing, as he is so far entering the outer courtyards of the third temple, as he approaches the mystical vision of God. Thank you so much for studying together 40a. Looking forward to studying 40b and the rest of the book of Ezekiel together.